There's a Pokemon that exists in a state between creation and corruption. A creature whose very DNA screams of manipulation, of something fundamentally wrong. And you've probably kept one in your party without ever questioning what it truly is. What if I told you that Eevee, the adorable, fluffy companion beloved by millions, might actually be one of the darkest experiments in the entire Pokemon world? An experiment that predates even Mewtwo, and one that stripped away something essential, something that makes a living being truly alive. What you're about to hear isn't just another lore video. This is about genetic manipulation, about the ethics of forced evolution, and about whether Eevee was ever meant to exist at all. By the end of this, you might never look at your Eevee the same way again. So, before we dive into the depths of this genetic nightmare, I want to hear from you. What's your favorite Eeveelution? And have you ever wondered why Eevee needs external forces to become anything at all? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're ready to go down this rabbit hole with me, hit that like button, because this journey gets dark. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the unsettling truths hiding in plain sight within the Pokemon world. Because trust me, this is just the beginning. Let's start with what we know, or rather, what the Pokédex wants us to believe. Eevee, number 133 in the National Pokédex, figuring the evolution Pokemon. On the surface, it's cute, it's friendly, it's one of the most popular Pokemon in existence. But pull back the curtain even slightly, and you'll find something deeply disturbing written into its very genetic code. The Pokédex entries for Eevee across multiple generations tell us something crucial. In Pokemon Red and Blue, the original games, we're told that Eevee possesses an irregular genetic code. Quote, "Its genetic code is irregular. It may mutate if it is exposed to radiation from element stones." Radiation. The word appears again and again throughout Eevee's documented history. Not evolution through training, not through natural growth, but through mutation caused by radiation exposure. In Pokemon Gold and Silver, the entry elaborates. Eevee has an unstable genetic makeup that suddenly mutates due to the environment in which it lives. Radiation from various stones causes this Pokemon to evolve. Unstable genetic makeup are the kind of instability you'd expect to find in something artificially created, something that wasn't meant to occur naturally. By Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, we get even more detail. Thanks to its unstable genetic makeup, this special Pokemon conceals many different possible evolutions. Special. That's an interesting word choice. Not natural, not ordinary, but special. As if the Pokédex itself is trying to soften the implications of what Eevee truly represents. The most damning entry comes from Pokemon Sun and Moon. Current studies show it can evolve into an incredible 8 different species of Pokemon. The question of why only Eevee has such unstable genes has still not been solved. Read that again. The question has not been solved. Maybe even in-universe researchers, with all their advanced technology and understanding of Pokemon biology, cannot explain why Eevee exists the way it does. It defies natural explanation. Because here's the thing that nobody wants to talk about. In the entire Pokemon world, across over 1,000 discovered species, no other Pokemon shares Eevee's genetic profile. Nothing else has this kind of radical instability. Nothing else transforms so completely, so fundamentally, in response to external stimuli. Eevee is utterly unique, and in biology, when something is that unique, that unprecedented, it usually means one of two things. Either it's an evolutionary dead end, or it's artificial. And Eevee is far from a dead end. It's thriving. It's everywhere. Which leaves us with option 2. Now, let's enter the realm of speculation. But speculation grounded in the evidence the games themselves provide. What if Eevee wasn't naturally occurring at all? What if Eevee was designed, created? What if it was an experiment that predates the horrific creation of Mewtwo? Consider the timeline. We know from the Pokemon Mansion journals on Cinnabar Island that Mewtwo was created through brutal genetic experimentation. The journals detail how scientists, including Blaine and the mysterious Dr. Fuji, discovered Mew in the jungles of Guyana. They took genetic material, implanted it in Mew, or extracted an embryo depending on which version of events you believe, and created Mewtwo through what the Pokédex itself calls horrific gene splicing and DNA engineering experiments. The word horrific appears in the official Pokédex entry, not challenging, not difficult, but horrific. These were experiments that even the scientists conducting them seemed to recognize as ethically monstrous. And they had a goal. The goal was to create the strongest Pokemon in existence, a biological weapon that could be controlled and deployed. But here's the question nobody asks. Was Mewtwo really the first attempt at this kind of genetic engineering? Or was there something that came before? A prototype, a proof of concept, a first attempt at creating a Pokemon with manipulable genetics? Look at what Eevee represents. It's a Pokemon whose entire existence is defined by adaptability. Its genetic structure allows it to transform into specialized forms, suited to virtually any environment or combat situation. Water-based combat, it becomes Vaporeon. Electric warfare, Jolteon. Flame-based assault, Flareon. Each evolution is perfectly optimized for its type, almost as if it was designed specifically to fill that role. And here's where it gets chilling. Imagine you're a scientist or a military strategist in the Pokemon world. You want to create the perfect weapon, but you're not sure what type of threat you'll face. Do you create a water type weapon? An electric type? A fire type? What if you're wrong? What if you need something different? The elegant solution? Create one base organism with radically unstable genetics. An organism that can be triggered to evolve into whatever form you need when you need it. Deploy it in a desert environment. It adapts. Deploy it near water. It adapts. Expose it to specific radiation frequencies from evolutionary stones, and it transforms into exactly the weapon you need for the situation at hand. This would explain so much about Eevee's nature. Its genetic instability isn't a flaw, it's a feature. It was designed to be unstable, designed to respond to external triggers, designed to be the ultimate adaptable weapon platform. And if this theory holds any water, It means that Eevee predates Mewtwo. It means that somewhere in the Pokemon world's history, long before the Cinnabar Island experiments, someone created Eevee as a biological weapon. And then, either through escape or deliberate release, it entered the wild population and began breeding, passing on its unstable genetics to every offspring. The scientist who created Mewtwo might have even known about Eevee. They might have studied it, learned from it. Mewtwo's creation might have built upon the foundation that Eevee established, taking the concept of genetic manipulation to its absolute extreme. But whether Eevee was deliberately created or is somehow a natural anomaly, there's one undeniable fact about its existence that should disturb anyone who thinks about it for more than a few seconds. Eevee cannot choose its own destiny. Think about almost any other Pokemon. A Charmander trains, grows stronger, bonds with its trainer, and eventually, through its own internal processes, it evolves into Charmeleon, then into Charizard. The evolution is triggered by the Pokemon's own growth, its own experience, its own development as a living being. Yes, the trainer guides that growth, but the fundamental trigger comes from within the Pokemon itself. The same is true for the vast majority of Pokemon. They level up. They reach a certain threshold of experience or maturity, and they evolve. It's a process that, while facilitated by training and battle experience, ultimately originates from the Pokemon's own biology responding to its development. Not Eevee. Eevee is the only Pokemon out of over 1,000 species that cannot evolve through its own internal processes. Every single one of its 8 evolutions requires an external trigger. Every single one requires something to be done to it, rather than coming from within. Let's break this down evolution by evolution, because the more you examine each evolution's requirements, the more disturbing the pattern becomes. Vaporeon, Jolteon, Flareon, the original 3 evolutions from Generation 1, each requires exposure to an evolutionary stone. A Water Stone, Thunderstone, or Firestone respectively. These stones emit radiation, as stated explicitly in multiple Pokédex entries, and that radiation triggers the mutation that transforms Eevee. Now, radiation-based evolution isn't unique to Eevee. Plenty of other Pokemon evolve through stones, but here's the key difference. For other Pokemon, stone evolution is one option among others. Pikachu can evolve via Thunderstone, but it doesn't have to. It could theoretically continue growing stronger without evolving. The choice, or at least the possibility of choice, exists. Eevee has no such option. If you want your Eevee to become something more than what it is, you must expose it to external forces. You must do something to it. It will never, can never evolve on its own. Then we have Espeon and Umbreon, introduced in Generation 2. These Pokemon represented something new, friendship-based evolution. Train with your Eevee, bond with it, raise its happiness to maximum, and then level it up during the day for Espeon, or during the night for Umbreon. On the surface, this seems less sinister. After all, it's based on friendship, on the bond between trainer and Pokemon. Surely that's natural. Surely that's better than radiation exposure. But And this is crucial. Think about what friendship evolution really means in Eevee's case. The happiness mechanic in Pokemon games is a numerical value. It goes from 0 to 255. You increase it through specific actions, walking with the Pokemon in your party, using items on it, winning battles, getting massages, feeding it special foods. For Eevee to evolve into Espeon or Umbreon, this value must reach 220 or higher. Then, and only then, when you've quantifiably maximized its happiness through deliberate actions, can you trigger the evolution by leveling it up at the correct time of day. Let's be honest about what this represents. This is manipulation. It's conditioning. You are systematically performing actions designed to increase a numerical value that represents the Pokemon's emotional state. And once that value reaches the threshold you need, you trigger the evolution. Does Eevee want to become Espeon? Fidun, does it desire to transform into Umbreon? We have no way of knowing. The evolution isn't triggered by the Pokemon's own wishes or growth. It's triggered by hitting a numerical threshold that the trainer controls, combined with the time of day. Another factor entirely outside the Pokemon's control. You're not fostering a natural bond. You're manipulating emotional and genetic triggers to force a specific transformation. The game mechanics make this explicit. Happiness is a resource you farm. Evolution is the result you harvest. Leafeon and Glaceon, introduced in Generation 4, originally required location-based evolution. You had to level up Eevee near a moss rock for Leafeon, or an ice rock for Glaceon. Later games simplified this to leaf stones and ice stones. Either way, once again, external factors. The Pokemon must be brought to a specific location or exposed to specific radiation. It has no agency in the process. And then there's Sylveon, the newest Eeveelution until another's potentially revealed. Sylveon requires the most complex conditions yet. Your Eevee must know a fairy-type move. Its friendship value must be high. And then you level it up. But here's something insidious about Sylveon's requirements. If your Eevee knows a fairy-type move and has high friendship, it will always evolve into Sylveon when leveled up. Always. Regardless of time of day, regardless of your intentions. The fairy-type move takes precedence over everything else. This means that if you wanted Espeon or Umbreon, but accidentally taught your Eevee a fairy-type move and leveled it up with high friendship, you get Sylveon instead. The Pokemon's genetic triggers are so specific, so hardwired, that they follow a strict hierarchy of responses. Fairy-type move plus friendship equals Sylveon. No exceptions. No variation. No choice. Eevee's evolution isn't a natural process of growth and development. It's a series of conditional statements hard-coded into its DNA. If-then statements. Programming. As if someone designed these triggers, these specific responses to specific stimuli, and embedded them into the genetic structure of every Eevee that has ever existed. Let's look at what Eevee becomes. Because each Eeveelution isn't just a different type, it's a completely specialized organism, optimized for its particular role with an efficiency that seems almost too perfect. Vaporeon. The Bubble Jet Pokemon. When Eevee is exposed to a water stone's radiation, its entire cellular structure transforms. Its body becomes capable of molecular transformation, literally melting into water to become invisible. Its cells are described as being similar to water molecules. Its tail becomes a mermaid-like fin. Its ears become webbed. Every aspect of its biology becomes perfectly adapted for aquatic existence and combat. This isn't evolution in the natural sense. Natural evolution takes millions of years, countless generations, gradual adaptation. This is instantaneous mutation. One moment you have a small, furry terrestrial mammal. The next moment, you have an aquatic predator with the ability to literally become one with water. The transformation is so complete, so radical, that it defies everything we understand about biological change. Jolteon, the lightning Pokemon. Thunderstone exposure causes Eevee to transform into a creature that generates enough electricity to create thunderstorms. Its fur becomes spiky and needle-like. Its cells generate negative ions. It can discharge 10,000 volts. Its entire physiology revolves around electricity generation and control. Again, this isn't adaptation. This is wholesale reconstruction. The radiation doesn't guide a natural process. It triggers a complete rewrite of the organism's biological systems. Organs that didn't exist suddenly appear. Cellular structures transform entirely. It's not evolution. It's metamorphosis on a scale that should be impossible for a mammalian creature. Flareon, the flame Pokemon. Firestone exposure causes Eevee's body temperature to rise to 1,750 degrees Fahrenheit. An internal flame sac develops. Its fur becomes capable of releasing heat. It can emit flames. This isn't just developing fire-type abilities. This is creating entirely new biological systems capable of generating and controlling fire at temperatures that would incinerate normal organic tissue. Each of the stone-based evolutions represents a complete biological overhaul, and they all happen instantly. The moment the stone touches the Pokemon, the transformation begins. There's no gradual change, no adaptation period, just immediate, total, irreversible mutation. Now let's look at the friendship-based evolutions, because they're fascinating for different reasons. Espeon, the sun Pokemon, psychic type. When Eevee's happiness reaches maximum and it levels up during daylight, it develops powerful psychic abilities. It can predict weather. It can sense danger. It develops a gem on its forehead that amplifies psychic power. Its entire sensory system becomes attuned to psychic energy. The implication here is chilling. Eevee's genetic structure is so precisely calibrated that emotional manipulation combined with specific environmental conditions triggers the development of extrasensory perception. Think about that. The act of bonding with a trainer, combined with daytime exposure, causes latent psychic genes to activate. It's as if Eevee's DNA contains dormant code for psychic abilities. Code that only activates under these specific conditions. Emotional bonding plus daytime equals psychic powers. It's a formula. A recipe. Not a natural developmental process, but a programmed response. Umbreon, the moonlight Pokemon. Dark type. Maximum happiness plus nighttime leveling equals a Pokemon that can blend into shadows, emit toxic sweat from its pores, and has rings on its body that glow when it's about to attack. The same happiness that creates a psychic type Espion creates a dark type Umbreon, simply based on whether it's day or night. The Pokemon's entire type affinity, its abilities, its combat role, all determined by what time of day you happen to level it up. Not by the Pokemon's nature or preferences, not by what it wants to become, but by an external factor as arbitrary as whether the sun is up or down. Leafeon, the verdant Pokemon, grass type, originally evolved near moss rocks, now through leaf stones. Its entire body becomes plant-like. It performs photosynthesis. Its tail and ears become leaf-shaped. It purifies air around it. Its cells literally become capable of chlorophyll production, an animal becoming part plant. An impossibility in natural biology. Yet for Eevee, it's just one more programmed response. Expose it to the right radiation or the right environmental trigger, and its cellular structure rewrites itself to incorporate plant biology. Glaceon, the fresh snow Pokemon, ice type, evolved near ice rocks or through ice stones. Its body temperature drops to minus 76 degrees Fahrenheit. It can freeze its own fur. It creates icy particles in the air. Its entire thermoregulatory system inverts, operating at temperatures that would kill any normal mammal. And finally, Sylveon, the intertwining Pokemon, fairy type. This one is perhaps the most interesting because its evolution requirements are so specific. Fairy type move plus high friendship. When these conditions are met, Eevee transforms into a creature that can emit waves from its ribbon-like feelers that erase hostility and calm emotions. Let me repeat, that nut. Sylveon can emit waves that alter emotional states. It can literally manipulate the feelings of other creatures. And this ability develops when Eevee, a Pokemon whose evolution is triggered by manipulated friendship, learns to manipulate emotions in others. The irony is almost too perfect. You manipulate Eevee's emotions to trigger evolution, and the result is a Pokemon whose defining ability is manipulating emotions. As if the process of its creation embedded this particular skill set into its genetic template. Each Eeveelution is perfectly optimized. Each is a specialist in its type. Each represents a complete transformation of the base organism. And all of it happens through external triggers, through things done to the Pokemon rather than internal growth. This is not how natural evolution works. This is not how biological development works. This is how design systems work. You have a base platform, Eevee, and you have multiple specialized configurations, the Eeveelutions, that can be activated through specific inputs. It's elegant. It's efficient. It's exactly what you'd design if you wanted a single organism that could fill multiple ecological or combat niches depending on need. And it strips Eevee of any agency in its own existence. Here's where we need to venture into uncomfortable philosophical territory. Does Eevee have a soul? I don't mean that in a strictly religious sense. I mean, does Eevee have a sense of self that extends beyond its programmed responses? Can it conceive of what it wants to become Or is it fundamentally incomplete? A living organism waiting for external forces to tell it what it should be. In the Pokemon world, we see countless examples of Pokemon displaying personality, preferences, desires. Ash's Pikachu refuses to evolve into Raichu. That's a choice, a conscious decision to remain as it is despite the option for change. Many Pokemon resist evolution until they're ready. Some never evolve at all by choice. But can Eevee make that choice? The evidence suggests it cannot. Every piece of lore, every game mechanic, every Pokédex entry points to Eevee being fundamentally reactive rather than proactive. It doesn't choose to evolve. It doesn't resist evolution. It simply responds to stimuli in predetermined ways. Consider what happens if you give Eevee an Everstone. The Everstone prevents evolution. For most Pokemon, this represents overriding their natural growth process. You're stopping something that wants to happen. But for Eevee, what are you stopping? Without external triggers, for B, Eevee wouldn't evolve anyway. The Everstone doesn't suppress Eevee's desires. It just prevents you from triggering the part. Transformation. Eevee in its base form is described as having the potential to evolve into multiple forms. Potential. Not desire. Not direction. Just potential. It's like an empty vessel waiting to be filled. A blank template waiting for someone to choose what it becomes. And that's profoundly tragic if you think about it. Every other Pokemon has an identity. A Charmander is a Charmander. It might become Charmeleon and then Charizard. But that evolution represents growth along an established path. The Charmander knows what it is and what it's growing toward. What does Eevee know? What is Eevee beyond its potential? Is there anything at its core other than genetic chaos waiting for direction? The Pokédex describes Eevee as friendly and adaptable. It's easy to bond with. It gets along with everyone. But isn't that also suspicious? It's almost too perfect. Too accommodating, as if it lacks a strong sense of self that might create friction or preferences. Eevee is whatever you need it to be, whatever you make it. It's the perfect companion, because it has no agenda of its own, no preferences that might conflict with yours, no identity that might resist your plans for what it should become. That's not companionship. That's programming. Let's focus specifically on Espeon, Umbreon, and Sylveon, because their evolution method raises some genuinely disturbing ethical questions that the Pokemon franchise never directly addresses. Friendship evolution sounds wonderful on paper. Your Pokemon loves you so much that your bond triggers its transformation. Chebrosh, it's heartwarming. Charbarisa, it's the core fantasy of Pokemon. Bizarrurus, that love and partnership make both trainer and Pokemon stronger. But let's examine what actually happens mechanically and narratively. You catch an Eevee. At this point, its friendship value is low, likely around 70 out of 255. To evolve it into Espeon or Umbreon, you need to raise that value to 220 or higher. So you begin the process. You walk with Eevee in your party. Every certain number of steps increases friendship. You use vitamins on it. Each vitamin adds points. You level it up through battles. More points. You give it a Soothe Bell to hold, which multiplies the friendship gains. You take it to get massages or haircuts. Even more points. You're not bonding naturally. You're farming friendship points. And you're doing it with a specific goal in mind. You want that number to hit 220. You want to trigger the evolution. Everything you do is calculated to increase that value. Is that love? Or is that manipulation? Now, one could argue that the actions themselves are loving. Ashin, walking together, caring for your Pokemon. These are good things regardless of motivation, bro. But the crucial question is, are you doing these things because you genuinely care about Eevee's well-being? Or are you doing them because you want to unlock Espion's psychic abilities? Be honest. When you're grinding friendship points, are you thinking about what Eevee wants? Or are you thinking about what you want Eevee to become? And here's the most disturbing part. Eevee has no choice in the matter. Once that friendship value hits the threshold and you level it up at the right time, transformation is automatic, irreversible. The Pokemon doesn't get asked, it doesn't consent. Its genetic triggers just activate. You've manipulated its emotional state to achieve a numerical value, and that value triggers a biological transformation. You're using your Pokemon's affection for you as a tool. Wrong. As a means to an end. The game calls it friendship evolution. A more accurate term might be emotional exploitation evolution. And it gets worse when you consider Sylveon. Remember, Sylveon requires high friendship plus a fairy type move. So not only are you manipulating emotional bonds, you're also teaching the Pokemon specific techniques. You're shaping its combat abilities. And when you've sufficiently molded both its emotional state and its skill set, you trigger the transformation. Sylveon's ability to manipulate emotions, to emit waves that control how others feel, suddenly seems less like a magical fairy power and more like a reflection of what was done to it. You manipulated its emotions. Now it can manipulate emotions. You used friendship as a tool. Now it has friendliness as a weapon. The Pokemon world presents friendship evolution as the ultimate expression of the trainer-Pokemon bond. But when you examine it critically, it's actually one of the most ethically questionable aspects of the entire evolution system, because at least with stone evolution, it's honest. You're using radiation to force a mutation. That's clearly manipulation. But friendship evolution disguises manipulation as love. It makes you complicit in emotional exploitation while telling you you're being a good trainer. You're not fostering a genuine bond. You're hitting psychological triggers to unlock a genetic response. And the saddest part, Eevee's genetics are so perfectly calibrated to respond to these triggers that it works every time, like clockwork, like programming. Does Espeon want to be psychic? Does Umbreon want to lurk in shadows? Does Sylveon want to manipulate emotions? We can't know, because the decision was never theirs to make. Their entire existence was determined by variables outside their control. Friendship value, time of day, move knowledge, all factors that the trainer controls. Eevee doesn't choose to become Espeon, you choose. And you make that choice by manipulating its emotional state until you've hit the required threshold. That's not friendship. That's conditioning. Beshijis. That's using psychological manipulation to achieve a desired outcome in a subject that has no ability to resist or refuse. It's just dressed up in cute game mechanics, so we don't have to think about what we're actually doing. Let's take a step back and look at the broader pattern. Because when you examine all of Eevee's evolutions together, a disturbing theme emerges. Every single evolution is about control. Stone evolutions, you control what stone to use and when. The Pokemon has no input. You expose it to radiation and force the mutation. Friendship evolutions, you control the happiness value through your actions. You control what time of day you level it up. You control what moves it knows. The Pokemon responds to conditions you've created. Location-based evolutions, you control where you take the Pokemon. Aruin, you decide when to level it up near the Moss Rock or Ice Rock. The Pokemon just reacts to being in the right place. In every scenario, the trainer has complete control over the outcome. Eevee is fundamentally passive. Inquiria, it doesn't evolve because it wants to or because it's ready. Inxahia, it evolves because someone did something to it or created conditions that triggered its genetic responses. This is antithetical to how evolution is portrayed for virtually every other Pokemon. Most Pokemon evolution represents growth, maturity, the Pokemon reaching a new stage of development. It's their journey. Ichiban, the trainer, facilitates it, but the Pokemon is the active participant. Eevee is never the active participant. Eevee is always the subject. It's something to be acted upon, a resource to be transformed into whatever the trainer needs. And if we return to the theory that Eevee was artificially created, this makes perfect sense. You wouldn't design a weapon to have opinions about what it becomes. You wouldn't want your adaptable combat platform to resist transforming into the form you need for the current situation. You'd design it to be responsive, to transform based on simple, controllable triggers. Expose it to this radiation. It becomes type A. Maximize this emotional value and level up at night. It becomes type B, simple, reliable, controllable. That's exactly what Eevee is, a perfectly controllable creature, a Pokemon that exists solely to become what others want it to be, and we celebrate this. Eevee is beloved precisely because of this trait. The many Eeveelutions are seen as amazing, as giving players choices. But they're not Eevee's choices. They're our choices. Eevee just exists to facilitate whatever we decide. There's something deeply unsettling about that when you really think about it. Here's something else worth considering. Eevee is the only Pokemon capable of evolving further that cannot evolve into a Pokemon that shares at least one type with it. Read that again slowly. Eevee is normal type. None of its 8 evolutions are normal type. Every evolution is a different type, and none of them retain any connection to what Eevee originally was. This is unique in the Pokemon world. When Pokemon evolve, they usually maintain some connection to their previous form. They might gain a new type, but they typically keep something. They keep a thread of continuity, a reminder of what they were. Eevee's evolutions don't do this. They completely replace what Eevee was. It's not that Eevee grows into Vaporeon. It's that Eevee stops being Eevee and becomes Vaporeon instead. Total replacement. complete transformation. Nothing of the original remains except the name and the vague awareness that this used to be something else. It's like Eevee isn't a real state. It's just a placeholder, a transitional form, something you're supposed to move past as quickly as possible. The game even kind of pushes you toward this. Eevee's base stats are mediocre. It's not particularly strong. It's not specialized for anything. It's just there, waiting to become something that actually matters. The implication is that Eevee's natural state is incomplete, that it's not meant to stay as Eevee, that its true purpose is to transform into one of the Eeveelutions. But who decided that? Did Eevee decide it? Or was it decided by whoever designed Eevee's genetics? Because if you're engineering an adaptable organism, you wouldn't want the base form to be optimal. You'd want it to be deliberately weak, deliberately incomplete. So there's incentive to trigger the evolution. So there's motivation to activate the transformation into one of the specialized forms. Eevee's mediocrity might not be an accident. It might be by design. Make the base form just competent enough to survive, but weak enough that trainers want to evolve it. Create a situation where keeping Eevee as Eevee feels like you're wasting potential, and it works. How often do you see trainers keeping Eevee in its base form? It happens, but it's rare. The overwhelming majority of Eevee end up evolved, transformed, turned into something other than what they are, because that's what Eevee is for, not for being Eevee, for becoming something else. Let's address something important. The theory that Eevee was created as a biological weapon faces an obvious counter-argument. Well, if Eevee was designed, if it was meant to be some kind of prototype or adaptable combat platform, why is it so common? Why isn't it locked away in some laboratory or extinct after a failed experiment? Here's where the theory gets more complex and perhaps more disturbing. What if Eevee was a failed experiment that succeeded anyway? Think about the Mewtwo situation. Mewtwo was created, proved too powerful and volatile, destroyed the laboratory, and escaped. The experiment was technically successful in creating a powerful Pokemon, but catastrophically unsuccessful in creating a controllable one. Mewtwo's story is one of a creation rejecting its creators and claiming autonomy through violence. But what if Eevee's story is different? What if the experiment failed not because the creation was too powerful, but because it was too passive, too dependent, too incomplete? Imagine scientists creating Eevee as an adaptable weapon platform. They successfully engineer the genetic instability. They successfully program the transformation triggers. They create something that can become whatever they need it to be. But there's a problem. Eevee in its base form is weak, vulnerable, and more importantly, it can't trigger its own transformations. It needs external input. It needs someone to make decisions for it. This would make it useless as an autonomous weapon. You can't deploy something into the field that requires constant handler intervention. A truly effective biological weapon needs to be self-sufficient. Eevee is the opposite. It's utterly dependent on external factors for its specialization. So the experiment is deemed a failure, Perhaps the laboratory is abandoned. Perhaps the project is shut down. Perhaps funding is cut. And the Eevee specimens, maybe they're released. Maybe they escape. Maybe they're simply left behind when the facility closes. But here's the thing about genetic engineering. Once you create a self-replicating organism and introduce it into the ecosystem, you lose control of what happens next. Eevee can breed. It passes on its unstable genetics to offspring. And suddenly, these failed experiments are propagating in the wild. From a military or scientific standpoint, this is a disaster. You've created an unstable genetic line that's now spreading uncontrollably. But from an evolutionary standpoint, Eevee's genetics might actually be advantageous in a different context. Because while Eevee can't evolve on its own, it turns out that evolutionary stones exist naturally in the Pokemon world. Porygonals. Trainers exist. Environments with specific properties exist. All the triggers that Eevee needs, they're available in the wild. Not reliably, not predictably, but they exist. So Eevee survives. It thrives even. Because in the Pokemon world, where trainers actively seek out and bond with Pokemon, where evolutionary stones can be found or purchased, where environments vary wildly, Eevee's dependency becomes less of a death sentence and more of an unusual quirk. Wild Eevee that never encounter the right triggers stay in their base form. They survive. They breed. They pass on the genes. Wild Eevee that happen to encounter stones or specific environments transform and fill specialized niches. An Eevee captured by trainers, they become whatever the trainer needs them to be. The failed experiment becomes a successful species through sheer accident. Through the unanticipated presence of facilitating factors in the environment. The weapon that needed handlers found handlers everywhere in the form of Pokemon trainers. It's a failure that succeeded, but only because the Pokemon world happened to be perfectly structured to compensate for Eevee's fundamental incompleteness. And that might be the most tragic aspect of all. Eevee survives not through its own merits, but because the world around it is willing to make choices on its behalf. It's a species that exists in a state of perpetual dependency, forever waiting for something external to give it purpose and direction. The experiment failed to create an autonomous weapon, but it succeeded in creating something else entirely. A living embodiment of helplessness. A creature defined by its inability to self-determine. Let's talk more deeply about what actually happens during stone-based evolution. Because the games and Pokédex entries use the word radiation very deliberately, and we need to understand what that implies. Evolution stones emit radiation. This isn't speculation or fan theory. It's stated explicitly across multiple generations. Eevee may mutate if it is exposed to radiation from element stones. The radiation from various stones causes this Pokemon to evolve. Radiation in our world causes mutations by damaging DNA. When living cells are exposed to radiation, the energy disrupts molecular bonds, particularly in genetic material. Most of these mutations are harmful. Cancer, cell death, genetic disorders. But occasionally, very rarely, a mutation might be neutral or even beneficial. Evolution stones in the Pokemon world seem to cause targeted mutations, The radiation doesn't randomly damage DNA. It triggers specific pre-programmed transformations. A water stone doesn't cause random aquatic mutations. It specifically causes Eevee to become Vaporeon. Every time, the same transformation, the same result. This shouldn't be possible with natural radiation. Random energy causing random molecular disruption should produce random results. But evolution stones produce consistent, predictable, identical outcomes. As if the radiation is reading genetic code and activating specific sequences. And here's what's truly disturbing about this. It means Eevee's DNA contains complete genetic blueprints for Vaporeon, Jolteon, Flareon, Leafeon, and Glaceon. All of them, simultaneously. These aren't developments or adaptations. They're dormant configurations waiting to be activated. Think about what that means for Eevee's genome. It's carrying the genetic information for creatures with fundamentally different biologies. Aquatic adaptations, electrical generation, flame production, photosynthesis, cryogenic thermoregulation. All of this information is packed into Eevee's cells, just waiting for the right radiation frequency to activate the correct sequence. This is not how natural genomes work. You don't have dormant genetic code for developing gills, just waiting for the right environmental trigger. Evolution doesn't work by having all possible adaptations preloaded into DNA. It works through gradual changes across generations. But Eevee has all these adaptations ready to go. Pre-coded, pre-designed, just locked behind activation requirements. When you expose Eevee to a water stone, the radiation acts like a key. It unlocks the Vaporeon genetic sequence. It tells Eevee's cells, execute transformation protocol, aquatic configuration. And the cells obey, immediately, completely, irreversibly. The transformation happens so fast that it's described as instantaneous in the games. One moment, a small terrestrial mammal. The next moment, an aquatic creature with completely different physiology. Organs appear. Body structure changes. Cellular composition transforms. All in the time it takes for the stone to touch the Pokemon. This level of radical restructuring should kill the organism. You can't rebuild a body's fundamental architecture while the organism is conscious and alive without catastrophic failure. But Eevee survives it because its genetic code was specifically designed to handle this kind of transformation. It was built for it. Each stone evolution represents activation of a different genetic subroutine. Thunderstone activates the electrical configuration. Firestone activates the thermal configuration. Leafstone activates the photosynthetic configuration. Ice stone activates the cryogenic configuration. These aren't evolutions. They're system changes. Like switching operating modes on a device. Press the water button. Get water functionality. Press the electric button. Get electric functionality. The base system is identical. Only the active configuration changes, and Eevee has no say in which button gets pressed. It doesn't choose water functionality over electric functionality. Someone else makes that choice. Someone else decides which dormant genetic code to activate. Someone else determines what Eevee becomes. The radiation bypasses any concept of consent or desire. It's a purely mechanical process. Stimulus and response, input and output. No consciousness required. No volition necessary. Just genes executing pre-programmed instructions. This is why stone evolution feels so different from other evolution methods. It's overt, it's undeniable, it's you, the trainer, forcing a transformation through direct intervention. You're not guiding growth, you're not facilitating development. You're activating genetic switches through radiation exposure. And the fact that this works, the fact that it works every single time without fail, proves that these genetic switches were deliberately installed. Natural organisms don't have fail-safe genetic reconfiguration protocols just lying dormant in their DNA. Those have to be designed, engineered, programmed. Every stone evolution is evidence that Eevee was constructed. Every successful transformation is proof of intelligent design behind its genetic architecture. And every time you use a stone on an Eevee, you're pulling the trigger on a biological weapon that someone else loaded long ago. Of all the Eeveelutions, Sylvian might be the most emotionally complex and ethically troubling. Because Sylvian's existence forces us to confront what we're actually doing when we claim to bond with Eevee. Sylvian evolves through high friendship combined with knowing a fairy-type move. On the surface, this seems like the purest form of evolution. Your Pokemon loves you. It learns to channel fairy-type energy. Your bond triggers a beautiful transformation into a creature that embodies affection and emotional connection. But let's examine this more carefully. Let's really think about what Sylvian represents and how it comes to be. First, the mechanical requirements. Friendship value of 220 or higher. Knowledge of a fairy-type move. Level up. When these conditions are met, Eevee must evolve into Sylvian. Not can, not might, must. It's mandatory, automatic. The genetic trigger fires and transformation happens whether anyone wants it to or not. Now, let's think about what this means. You've systematically manipulated Eevee's emotional state to reach a specific numerical threshold. You've taught it a specific type of move. You've created a precise set of conditions. And when those conditions are met, Eevee's body betrays its current form and forcibly reconstructs itself. But here's what makes Sylvian special. Here's what makes it different from Espian or Umbreon. The fairy-type move requirement adds an extra layer of specificity. It's not just emotional manipulation. It's emotional manipulation combined with skill training. You're shaping both the Pokemon's feelings and its abilities. You're molding it in 2 dimensions simultaneously. And what does Sylvian become? What is its defining characteristic? The ability to manipulate emotions. Sylvian emits waves from its ribbon-like feelers that erase hostility, that calm anger, that soothe conflict, it literally alters the emotional states of other creatures. It reaches into their minds and changes how they feel. Do you see the parallel? Do you see the sick irony? You manipulate Eevee's emotions to trigger evolution. And the evolution produces a Pokemon whose power is manipulating emotions. You use emotional exploitation as a tool, and you create a creature whose tool is emotional exploitation. It's as if the transformation process took what was done to Eevee and encoded it as Sylvian's primary function. Oi, you weaponized affection to force evolution. So the evolution weaponizes affection for combat. The Pokédex entries make this even clearer. In Generation 7, we learn that Sylvian uses its aura to distract prey while hunting. It's not just calming fights between friends, it's using emotional manipulation as a predatory technique. Lower your target's hostility, make them trust you, make them drop their guard. Then strike. That's not friendship. Sakritin. That's deception. That's using the appearance of kindness as camouflage for violence. And we created this. We created Sylvian by doing essentially the same thing. Because we use the appearance of friendship, walking together, giving treats, spending time together, to create the emotional conditions necessary for transformation. Were we genuinely bonding? Or were we dropping Eevee's guard so we could strike it with forced evolution? Sylvian's Pokédex entries describe it as affectionate. It walks with its trainer, wrapping its feelers around their arm like they're holding hands. It seems to love its trainer deeply. But is that love? Or is that the result of the conditioning that created it? Is Sylvian affectionate because it chose to be? Or because its evolution was literally triggered by artificially maximized affection values? Consider this. Sylvian cannot exist without high friendship. It's a prerequisite for the transformation. So every Sylvian that exists was created through emotional manipulation. Every Sylvian's foundational experience is having its feelings exploited to force biological transformation. Every Sylvian exists because someone hit 220 friendship points and pulled the trigger on evolution. And now Sylvian is affectionate, loving, bonded to its trainer. But is that genuine affection? Or is that Stockholm Syndrome encoded into genetic programming? You manipulated Eevee's emotions until you reached the required threshold. You triggered transformation, and the result is a creature that seems to adore you unconditionally, a creature that literally radiates emotional influence, a creature whose entire existence validates the emotional manipulation that created it. It's a closed loop. You exploit emotions to create Sylvian. Sylvian exists to exploit emotions. Sylvian's behavior makes you feel like the emotional exploitation was actually genuine bonding. And the cycle perpetuates. The Pokemon world calls this beautiful. Sylvian is marketed as the epitome of the trainer-Pokemon bond. It's cute, it's elegant, it's associated with love and friendship and partnership. But underneath the ribbons and the pastel colors and the fairy-type magic, Sylvian is a living monument to emotional exploitation. It exists because someone figured out how to quantify affection, farm it like a resource, and use it to trigger genetic transformation. And it perpetuates that cycle by making emotional manipulation look like love. Every time you see a Sylvian, you're seeing the result of weaponized friendship. Every time a Sylvian uses its powers to calm someone, you're watching emotional manipulation in action. And every time the game tells you how much your Sylvian loves you, you have to wonder whether that love is real or just another pre-programmed response to the conditions that created it. Sylvian is beautiful Sylvian is affectionate. Sylvian is the perfect companion, and Sylvian is the most horrifying proof that Eevee was never meant to have agency. Espeon and Umbreon represent something fascinating and equally troubling. 2 evolutions. Same base requirements, high friendship, level up. The only difference, whether it's day or night, same emotional manipulation, same numerical threshold, same artificially cultivated bond. But daytime produces a psychic type, and nighttime produces a dark type, light and shadow, mental powers and deception. Taberixin. 2 diametrically opposed results from essentially identical conditions. What does this tell us about Eevee's genetic programming? It tells us that the DNA doesn't just respond to emotional states. It responds to environmental factors. Specifically, it responds to light levels, the presence or absence of solar radiation. This adds another layer to the pre-programming. Another conditional statement in the genetic code. If friendship value 220 and time of day, shy daytime, then activate psychic configuration. If friendship value 220 and time of day, nighttime, then activate dark configuration. It's elegant from a design standpoint. You've created a system where the same emotional manipulation produces different outcomes based on when you trigger the transformation. Maximum flexibility with minimal additional complexity. Just add a light detection mechanism to the genetic switches. But think about what this means for Espeon and Umbreon as individuals. Think about their existence. An Eevee that becomes Espeon had its transformation triggered during the day. Maybe its trainer deliberately waited for daytime because they wanted a psychic type. Maybe it was coincidence. The Eevee happened to level up during morning training. Either way, that Eevee became Espeon because of something as arbitrary as solar position. Would that same Eevee have wanted to become Espeon? Or would it have preferred Umbreon? We can't know. Because Eevee doesn't get to want anything. The decision was made by the planet's rotation, and here's what's particularly insidious about this. Trainers absolutely plan around this. You can look up guides, Yinabari strategies, Ikwari, how to get Espeon versus Umbreon. Want a psychic guess? The advice is always the same. Shith, max friendship, Maesterschnee, then level up when you want the evolution you want. Poco out daytime for Espeon, and nighttime for Umbreon. Simple. You're timing planetary rotation to trigger genetic transformation in a living creature. You're using the day-night cycle as a targeting system. Point at Eevee. Wait for the right time. Pull the trigger. Get the result you wanted. And what does each evolution become? Espeon gains psychic powers, precognition, telekinesis, the ability to sense thoughts and feelings. Its forehead gem amplifies psychic energy. It becomes a creature of pure mental force. Umbreon gains the opposite, the power of shadow and deception, poison secretion, the ability to blend into darkness, rings that glow when it's about to attack, a warning system for aggression. It becomes a creature of physical and psychological darkness. Light produces enlightenment. Darkness produces deception. Day equals mental powers. Night equals shadowy tricks. It's almost too perfect, too thematically appropriate. As if someone designed these transformations to align with symbolic meanings of light and darkness. And maybe someone did. If Eevee was engineered, if its evolutions were designed, then Espeon and Umbreon might represent deliberate symbolic programming. Create a psychic type associated with light and day because that's culturally associated with knowledge and clarity. But create a dark type associated with night and shadow because that's culturally associated with mystery and danger. The designers of Eevee's genetics didn't just create functional transformations. They created thematically appropriate ones. They encoded cultural symbolism into biological processes. They made the genetics poetic. But here's the problem with poetry. It sacrifices truth for beauty. It prioritizes aesthetics over autonomy. Espeon isn't psychic because the Eevee had latent psychic potential that blossomed through emotional bonding. Espeon is psychic because someone leveled it up when the sun was visible. That's not meaningful. That's not profound. That's just timing. Umbreon isn't dark and deceptive because that Eevee had a mysterious nature that emerged through partnership. Umbreon is dark because someone leveled it up when the sun wasn't visible. Again, just timing. Just planetary mechanics. The poetry is false. The symbolism is artificial. The thematic appropriateness is the result of design, not development. Espeon and Umbreon look like they represent something meaningful about the Eevee they came from. But they don't. They only represent what time of day it was when someone pulled the evolution trigger. And yet, trainers form deep bonds with their Espeon and Umbreon, being they see personality in them. They believe the evolution reflected something about their partnership. Day or night, light or dark, psychic or shadow. It all seems so meaningful, but it's not. It's just programming responding to environmental input. No meaning, no significance. Just another if-then statement executing on schedule. Espeon and Umbreon are beautiful. They're powerful. They're fan favorites. And they exist purely because someone timed a level up correctly. Not because of who Eevee was. Not because of what Eevee wanted. Just because of when the transformation was triggered. That's not evolution, that's scheduling. Leafeon and Glaceon originally had something other Eeveelutions didn't. Location-based evolution. You had to take Eevee to a specific place. Level it up near a moss rock for Leafeon. Near an ice rock for Glaceon. Later games simplified this to leaf stones and ice stones, bringing them in line with the other stone evolutions. But the original method reveals something important about how Eevee's genetics interact with environment. The moss rock and ice rock aren't just landmarks, they're sources of specific environmental radiation or energy. The moss rock emits something that triggers plant-based genetic activation. The ice rock emits something that triggers cryogenic genetic activation. Though Eevee's DNA is sensitive enough to detect these environmental signatures and respond by executing the appropriate transformation protocol. This means Eevee's genetic programming includes geolocation functionality. It can sense specific environmental conditions and match them to the correct evolution path. Not just there's radiation present, but there's moss rock radiation present. Activate plant protocol versus there's ice rock radiation present. Activate cold protocol. The level of sophistication this requires is staggering. Eevee's cells need sensory mechanisms to detect different types of environmental energy. They need processing systems to identify which energy corresponds to which transformation. They need activation systems to trigger the correct genetic sequence. And all of this needs to function reliably without external guidance. But there's a catch. Eevee can't trigger this on its own. It can't just walk up to a moss rock and evolve. It needs to level up. It needs that final input from growth and experience. As if the environmental detection prepares the transformation. But trainer intervention is still required to execute it. Even when evolution appears most natural, even when it seems like Eevee is just responding to its environment. Trainer agency is still mandatory. You still have to bring Eevee to the location. You still have to level it up at the right moment. The Pokemon can't do this alone. And what does this produce? Leafeon becomes a plant hybrid, photosynthesis, leaf-shaped appendages. Now, the ability to purify air, it's described as sharing traits with plants. Its cells performing chlorophyll-based energy generation. An animal becoming partially plant. Crossing kingdoms of life. Reorganizing cellular metabolism from heterotrophic to autotrophic. This should be impossible. You can't just rewire an organism's entire energy generation system. Heterotrophs consume other organisms for energy. Autotrophs generate energy from sunlight. These are fundamentally different survival strategies that require completely different cellular machinery. But Leafeon does it anyway, because its genetic code was programmed to execute this transformation when triggered. Glaceon becomes a cryogenic organism. Body temperature drops to minus 76 degrees Fahrenheit. It freezes its own fur. It creates ice crystals in the air around it. Normal mammalian biology cannot function at these temperatures. Cells freeze. Metabolic processes stop. Tissues crystallize. But Glaceon cells were designed to operate in these conditions. The transformation doesn't just lower temperature. It rebuilds the organism's entire physiology to function in an environment that would kill its previous form. Leafeon and Glaceon represent adaptations to extreme environments. Brown, dense forests where plant-like camouflage and energy generation provide advantages. Arctic regions where cryogenic biology enables survival. They're specialized for niches that most Pokemon couldn't occupy. And if you're designing an adaptable weapon platform, this makes perfect sense. You'd want configurations for different terrains. Urban combat, water-based, desert warfare, Arctic operations. Each environment gets its own specialized form. Leafeon and Glaceon fill the ecological specialist roles. But in doing so, they become even further removed from what Eevee was. At least Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon remain recognizably animal-like. At least Espeon and Umbreon are still mammals with standard biology supplemented by special powers. But Leafeon and Glaceon cross fundamental biological boundaries. One becomes part plant. One becomes something that operates below freezing. These aren't just type changes. These are kingdom changes. Metabolic system changes. Fundamental reorganization of what kind of organism the Pokemon is. And it all happens because someone brought Eevee to the right rock and leveled it up. Or later, because someone used the right stone. That's all it takes to completely rewrite the rules of biology governing a living creature's existence. Leafeon and Galaxion prove that Eevee's genetic programming goes beyond simple type specialization. It includes protocols for crossing the boundaries between different forms of life entirely. Plant-animal hybrids, cryogenic metabolisms, biological impossibilities made routine through pre-programmed genetic sequences. If this was natural, it would be miraculous. But it's not miraculous, it's engineered. And engineering of this sophistication doesn't happen by accident. Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon deserve special attention because they were the original three, the first Eeveelutions. The proof of concept that Eevee could transform into multiple specialized forms, and they represent the three most fundamental elemental forces: water, electricity, fire, not grass or ice or psychic or dark. The absolute basics, the elements that dominate natural phenomena. If you were designing a first-generation adaptable weapon, these are the three you'd choose. Water for aquatic operations and adaptability. Electricity for raw destructive power and disruption. Fire for devastation and area denial. These three types cover the majority of combat scenarios you'd encounter. Vaporeon's transformation is perhaps the most radical. Its cellular structure becomes similar to water molecules, allowing it to literally dissolve into liquid. It can detect rain before it starts. It can melt into water to become invisible. This isn't just developing aquatic adaptations. This is matter state manipulation. Solid organism to liquid form and back. The physics involved are staggering. When Eevee becomes Vaporeon, it gains the ability to control its molecular coherence, to transition between solid and liquid states at will. This requires cellular machinery that doesn't exist in normal biology. Cells that can dissolve their membranes and reform them. Organelles that can suspend function and resume it. DNA that can survive dispersion and reconstitution. This is Star Trek level technology. Molecular transportation, meshes, matter reconstitution, and it's supposedly triggered by exposing a small furry mammal to radiation from a blue stone. The simplicity of the trigger compared to the complexity of the result is damning evidence of design. Natural processes don't create sophisticated transformations from simple inputs, but design systems do. You create a complex mechanism, then you create a simple interface to activate it. The water stone is just a button. The real sophistication is in Eevee's DNA. Jolteon generates electricity. 10,000 volts. Its fur becomes needle-like and charged with static. It can create thunderstorms. Where does the energy come from? How does a biological organism generate that much electrical potential without destroying its own cells? Electric Pokemon have always been somewhat mysterious in their power source. But Jolteon's transformation reveals something interesting. Its cells generate negative ions. Its fur accumulates static charge. Its entire body becomes a biological capacitor. This requires specialized organs, specialized tissues, specialized cellular mechanisms for electron manipulation. None of this exists in Eevee. Eevee is a normal mammal. It has normal cells, normal metabolism, normal biology. Then you expose it to a thunderstone, and suddenly its entire cellular structure reconfigures to generate and store massive electrical charges. Bahar, organs appear that weren't there before. Metabolic pathways develop that allow electricity generation without electrocuting the organism. Kutum, all instantly. This is impossible through natural mutation. But it's trivial for pre-programmed genetic transformation. The thunderstone activates dormant genetic sequences. The cells execute their instructions, and Jolteon emerges fully formed. Flareon reaches internal temperatures of 1,750 degrees Fahrenheit. It has an internal flame sac. It can exhale fire. Its fur stores heat. These are adaptations that would normally require millions of years of evolution in volcanic environments. But Eevee gains them instantly from firestone exposure. The internal temperature alone should be lethal. No mammalian tissue can survive those temperatures. Blood would boil. Proteins would denature. Cells would cook. But Flareon's cells are designed to operate at these extremes. The transformation doesn't just add fire abilities, it completely rebuilds thermal tolerance into every cell. When people play Pokemon, they think cool. Eevee can become a fire type. Eevee, they don't think about what that actually means. They don't consider the biological implications. They don't ask how a creature can have its entire thermal regulatory system rebuilt in seconds. But if you do ask these questions, the only answer that makes sense is deliberate design. These transformations are too sophisticated, too complete, too functional to be anything but engineered. Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon were the first proof that Eevee could be anything. And they demonstrated engineering on a scale that shouldn't be possible. Molecular reconstitution, bioelectrical generation, extreme thermal adaptation, all from simple stone exposure, all pre-programmed into Eevee's genetic code. They're not just Pokemon, they're evidence. Evidence that someone in the distant past of the Pokemon world had mastery over genetics that rivals or exceeds anything we see in modern games. Someone who could code transformation protocols into DNA. Someone who could create an organism that contains blueprints for multiple radically different forms. Someone who could make it all activate from simple external triggers. The original 3 Eeveelutions are proof of concept. Proof that the Eevee project worked, or proof that adaptive transformation through triggered genetic protocols was possible, and proof that Eevee was never meant to be just Eevee. We need to address the philosophical elephant in the room: free will, agency, the ability of a conscious being to make choices about its own existence. Does Eevee have free will? Most Pokemon demonstrate clear preferences and choices. They choose to battle or not battle. They choose to obey their trainers or disobey them. They form bonds, hold grudges, make friends, express desires. Ash's Pikachu choosing not to evolve isn't just game mechanics. It's portrayed as a genuine choice by a conscious being. But can Eevee make choices about what it becomes? The answer appears to be no. Or more precisely, the question doesn't even make sense in the context of how Eevee functions. Eevee doesn't have the framework to make this choice because Eevee's entire existence is about not having a defined form. It's about being undefined until external factors define it. Think about it from Eevee's perspective, assuming it has one. What does it want? Does it want to be aquatic, electrical, fiery? It can't know, because it has the genetic programming for all of them simultaneously. Its identity is quantum. It exists in superposition. All possible evolutions exist as potential within it, and it won't collapse into a specific state until observation, until measurement, until someone applies a trigger. This is genuinely horrifying when you think about it. Eevee doesn't have an identity waiting to emerge. It has multiple contradictory identities, all existing as dormant possibilities. It's a living Schrodinger's cat. Oh, except instead of being dead or alive, it's simultaneously predatory aquatic creature, an electrical generator and flame beast, and psychic entity and shadow lurker and plant hybrid and cryogenic anomaly and emotion manipulator. How can you have free will when you don't have a defined self? How can you choose what to become when you're genetically programmed to become whatever external stimuli dictate? How can you have agency when your entire biological framework is designed to be reactive rather than proactive? Eevee might be conscious. It might have thoughts and feelings. But does it have a will? Does it have desires about its own future? Or is it just an awareness floating in genetic chaos, waiting for something external to give it shape and purpose? Compare this to literally any other Pokemon. A Charmander might not know it will become Charizard, but it has a defined identity as it grows. It's a fire-type lizard that's developing and maturing. Its evolution is growth along an established path. The Charmander that becomes Charizard is still fundamentally the same being, just more developed. But the Eevee that becomes Vaporeon isn't the same being anymore, not even close. The personalities might carry over, the memories might remain, but the fundamental nature of what it is has completely changed. From terrestrial to aquatic, from solid to liquid capable, from normal type biology to water type biology. Is there continuity of self across that transformation? Is the Vaporeon the same individual as the Eevee? Or did the Eevee cease to exist, replaced by a new being that inherited its memories? The ship of Theseus thought experiment asks whether an object that has had all its components replaced is still the same object. Eevee's evolution is more extreme. It's not replacing components, it's replacing the entire blueprint. The fundamental organizational principles of the organism change. How can identity survive that? And more importantly, does Eevee understand this? Does it know that evolution will fundamentally alter what it is? Does it consent to that transformation? Or does it just feel a sudden surge of energy? And then it's something else. Wondering what happened, we can't know. The games don't tell us. The Pokédex doesn't address it. We just see Eevee go into the transformation and Vaporeon come out. We assume continuity because we want there to be continuity, but the biological reality suggests something more disturbing. What we call Eevee-evolution might actually be Eevee death and Eeveelution birth. The same atoms, the same molecules, but completely reorganized into something new. Is that growth? Or is that replacement? And if it is replacement, then every time we evolve an Eevee, we're not helping it grow. We're killing what it was and creating something new from its constituent matter. We're committing premeditated transformation. We're erasing one form of existence and overwriting it with another. The game calls it evolution. The trainers call it bonding. The players call it making strategic choices. But what if we're all complicit in something far darker? What if every evolution is a small death? A sacrifice of what could have been for what we decided should be. Eevee can't have free will because Eevee was designed not to have a stable form to exercise will from. It exists in a state of perpetual potentiality, never quite real, never quite complete, waiting for external forces to collapse its quantum state into one specific reality. And we celebrate this. We call it cute. We call it wonderful. We call it giving Eevee possibilities. But we never ask Eevee what it wants. We never check if it wants any of this. We just pull the trigger and watch the transformation happen and feel satisfied that we've made a choice. But it was always our choice, never Eevee's. Because Eevee was designed never to choose. That's not a companion. That's not a partner. That's a victim of its own genetic programming. Forever at the mercy of external forces, it can neither understand nor resist. And that might be the darkest truth about Eevee. Not that it was created, not that it's a weapon, but that it was specifically created to lack the agency necessary to object to what's done to it. Eevee is the perfect slave, not because it obeys commands, but because it was genetically engineered to lack the capacity to rebel against its own transformation. Let's be brutally honest about what the Pokemon franchise has normalized. We take a creature with unstable genetics, we manipulate its emotional state, or expose it to radiation, or bring it to specific locations. We trigger irreversible biological transformation that completely rewrites what the organism is. And we call this gameplay. The Pokemon Company markets Eevee as the ultimate companion. So many possibilities, so many choices. You can have the evolution you want, but they're not Eevee's choices. They're yours. Every single decision about what Eevee becomes is made by someone other than Eevee. The Pokemon exists solely to facilitate human choice about what type of creature we want. And we don't question this. We don't ask if Eevee wants to dissolve into water, or generate 10,000 volts, or burn at 1,650 degrees internally. We just assume that because the transformation is possible, it's acceptable. But possibility doesn't equal ethics. Or, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And just because a creature's genetics are designed to respond to manipulation doesn't mean that manipulation is okay. If you encountered a human with a condition that made them extremely susceptible to suggestion, would it be ethical to exploit that condition to make them do what you want? Obviously not. We recognize that exploiting someone's vulnerability or neurological condition is wrong, even if it's effective. But Eevee's genetic vulnerability to manipulation is portrayed as a feature, not a flaw. As something wonderful, not something tragic. As expanding possibilities, not as enabling exploitation. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. We claim to love Pokemon. We claim to bond with them. We claim the human-Pokemon relationship is sacred. But then we take Eevee, whose entire biology is designed to be manipulated. and we manipulate it without hesitation or guilt. Friendship evolution is particularly insidious because it disguises exploitation as love. You're not manipulating Eevee, you're bonding with it. You're not forcing transformation. Your deep connection is triggering natural growth. But strip away the marketing language and look at the mechanics. You systematically perform actions that increase a numerical value. When that value hits a threshold, you trigger irreversible biological transformation. The Pokemon's actual feelings, its actual desires, its actual preferences are never consulted. They can't be consulted. Because the system doesn't allow for refusal. And stone evolution is even worse. At least friendship evolution requires time and interaction. Stone evolution is instant. No buildup. No relationship. Just radiation exposure and forced mutation. You can catch an Eevee, immediately expose it to a water stone, and force it to become Vaporeon without ever letting it process what's happening to it. The games reward this. You get a powerful Pokemon instantly. You can fill your Pokedex. You can build the perfect team. All by treating Eevee as raw material to be processed into whatever form serves your needs. And nobody in the Pokemon world questions this. Eevee, no ethics committees, no regulations, no debate about whether it's right to force biological transformation on creatures designed to be vulnerable to transformation triggers. It's just normal. It's just how things work. It's just what you do with Eevee. But normalized doesn't mean acceptable. It just means we've stopped noticing how wrong it is. Let's return to Cinnabar Island. The place where Mewtwo was created. The site of horrific genetic experiments. The location of the Pokemon Mansion where journals document the creation of the most powerful Pokemon in existence. But Mewtwo wasn't the first genetic experiment on Cinnabar. The journals mention multiple attempts, failed clones, experiments that didn't survive. The scientists were trying to perfect the process. And where do we find Ditto? The transformed Pokemon. A creature that can shift its cellular structure to mimic any Pokemon it sees. Sarkari, Cinnabar Island. In the same mansion. In the same burned ruins where Mewtwo's creation was documented. Fan theories have long connected Ditto to failed Mew cloning attempts. Its color matches Mew's shiny form. Its ability to transform parallels Mew's transformation abilities. Its genetic flexibility suggests it's related to Mew somehow. But what if Ditto isn't the only genetic experiment that escaped or was released from Cinnabar? What if Eevee was a Cinnabar project? Consider the evidence. Eevee has unstable genetics. Check. Eevee transforms in response to specific stimuli. Check. Eevee's transformations are too sophisticated to be natural. Check. And Eevee is found near Cinnabar in the original games. Check. Celadon Mansion is where you get your Eevee in Generation 1. But Celadon is close to Cinnabar in relative terms. And if Eevee was being bred or studied at multiple sites, the original specimens could have spread from Cinnabar to other research facilities. The timeline would work. Ancient experiments create Eevee as an adaptable weapon platform. The project fails or is abandoned. Specimens escape or are released. They breed and spread into the wild population. Centuries or millennia pass. Wiser, by the time of the modern games, Eevee is just accepted as a rare but naturally occurring Pokemon. Nobody remembers or knows it was originally created. Then the Cinnabar scientists, studying genetics and cloning, might have rediscovered Eevee and recognized it as artificial. They might have studied it, learned from it, used it as a foundation for understanding how to manipulate Pokemon genetics. And then they created Mewtwo, using principles they learned from Eevee, taking the concept of program transformation and pushing it to the absolute extreme, creating not a creature that could become multiple forms, but a creature with overwhelming power in a single form. The Pokemon Mansion might not just be where Mewtwo was created, it might be where humanity rediscovered the secrets of Eevee's genetics, where they realized that genetic transformation protocols could be coded into DNA, where they learned that creatures could be designed to transform in response to specific triggers. Mewtwo is famous as humanity's most controversial genetic experiment. But Eevee might be the template, the proof of concept, the original sin. And unlike Mewtwo, who rebelled and destroyed his creators, Eevee never rebelled. Because Eevee was designed not to rebel, designed to be compliant, designed to accept whatever is done to it. Mewtwo is the tragedy of a weapon gaining consciousness and rejecting its purpose. Eevee is the tragedy of a weapon that can never reject anything. The burned Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar stands as a monument to the dangers of genetic engineering. Everyone looks at it and thinks of Mewtwo. But maybe they should be thinking of Eevee too. The success that enabled the failure. The compliant experiment that made scientists confident they could create the defiant one. Cinnabar Island destroyed itself through genetic hubris, but the seeds of that hubris might have been planted long before, in the unstable genetics of a small, furry, helplessly transformable Pokemon that people thought was cute. If we're honest about what Eevee represents, it teaches us something profoundly uncomfortable about the Pokemon world, and perhaps about ourselves. Eevee teaches us that we find helplessness attractive, that we find dependency endearing, that we find the absence of agency in something we can control desirable. We love Eevee because it can become anything we want, not anything it wants. Anything we want. Its value is entirely derived from its utility to us, from its malleability, from its inability to resist our will. And we've built an entire aspect of Pokemon culture around celebrating this. Eeveelution fan art, Eeveelution teams, debates about which Eeveelution is best, all of it focused on the results of transformation, never on whether Eevee wanted to transform. We treat Eevee's lack of agency as a feature because it gives us total control. We treat its genetic instability as wonderful because it creates variety for us to collect. We treat its complete dependency on external factors as adorable because it makes Eevee perpetually need us. And this is disturbing because it reveals something about how we conceptualize relationships with beings that have less power than us. We're comfortable with forcing fundamental change on them as long as we can. Frame it as growth, as helping them reach their potential, as giving them opportunities. But whose potential? Whose definition of growth? Whose opportunities? Always ours. Never theirs. Eevee is the perfect metaphor for every relationship, where one party has absolute power over another's fundamental nature. Parent-child relationships where parents force children into predetermined paths. Educational systems that mold students into specific shapes regardless of individual desires. Social structures that demand conformity to survive. Eevee shows us what happens when you're designed to be moldable, when your value comes from your ability to become what others need you to be. When your lack of resistance is treated as virtue rather than violation, and the Pokemon world doesn't just accept this, it celebrates it. In Cabo, it markets it. It makes Eevee into mascots and merchandise and beloved companions, but Eevee isn't beloved for what it is. Eevee is beloved for what we can make it become. And that's not love. That's objectification. That's seeing something as raw material rather than as a being with inherent worth. Every time we celebrate how many forms Eevee can take, we're celebrating its lack of fixed identity. Every time we argue about which Eevee-elution is superior, we're arguing about the optimal use of genetic malleability. Every time we build teams around multiple Eevee-elutions, we're treating Eevee as a strategic resource to be deployed. And the most troubling part, we're teaching this to children. Pokemon is marketed to kids, and one of its central messages is, here's a creature that can be anything you want. Just apply the right triggers, and it will transform to suit your needs. What does that teach about consent? What does that teach about respecting autonomy? What does that teach about the ethics of forcing change on beings that can't refuse? It teaches that if something is designed to be changed, changing it is acceptable. That if you have the power to transform something, you should exercise that power. That if a being's genetics make it vulnerable to manipulation, manipulating those genetics is not just permissible, but desirable. These are dangerous lessons wrapped in adorable packaging. In fluffy tails and big eyes and pastel colors, Eevee might be the darkest element in Pokemon. Not because of what it is, but because of what it reveals about us. About what we're willing to do to things weaker than ourselves. About what we're willing to call partnership when it's actually domination. The tragedy of Eevee isn't that it was created as a weapon. The tragedy is that we turned it into a beloved symbol, and in doing so, we normalized everything that's fundamentally wrong with it. We made helplessness marketable. We made exploitation cute. We made the absence of free will into something to celebrate. And every time a child evolves their Eevee, they're learning that this is okay. That forcing transformation on something designed to be transformed is not just acceptable, but good. That love means reshaping others to serve your preferences. Eevee is a mirror, and what it reflects is deeply uncomfortable. It shows us the trainer-Pokemon relationship stripped of its romantic veneer. Power, control, manipulation disguised as care. We don't love Eevee, we love what we can do to Eevee. And we've convinced ourselves that's the same thing. Everything we've discussed about Eevee, all the disturbing implications of its genetic programming, all the ethical violations embedded in its existence, they don't exist in isolation. Eevee isn't an anomaly in the Pokemon world. It's a symptom. Because once you see what's wrong with Eevee, Once you understand the fundamental lack of agency built into its DNA, you start noticing similar patterns everywhere. Evolution stones work on multiple Pokemon species. Pikachu becomes Raichu through Thunderstone exposure. Gloom becomes Vileplume through Leaf Stone. Clefairy becomes Clefable through Moonstone. All forced transformations, all irreversible mutations triggered by external radiation, all decisions made by trainers rather than the Pokemon themselves. Friendship evolution exists for dozens of species beyond Eevee. Golbat becomes Crobat, Chansey becomes Blissey, Riolu becomes Lucario, all requiring trainers to manipulate happiness values to specific thresholds, all presenting emotional conditioning as natural bonding. Trade evolution forces Pokemon to be separated from their trainers and sent to strangers to trigger transformation. Graveler becomes Golem, Haunter becomes Gengar, Kadabra becomes Alakazam. The Pokemon has no choice. The trauma of being traded away from someone they bonded with becomes the trigger for biological change. Location-based evolution requires trainers to bring Pokemon to specific places. Magneton to Mount Coronet to become Magnezone. Nosepass to Chargestone Cave to become Probopass. The Pokemon can't go there on its own. Can't trigger the evolution through autonomous action. Needs to be brought there by someone with the authority and ability to make that choice. The entire evolution system in Pokemon, when you really examine it, is built on the premise that Pokemon don't control their own development. Trainers do, environments do, items do. But the Pokemon themselves? They're passengers in their own transformation. Eevee is just the most extreme example. The most obvious case of being designed to lack agency. But it's not alone. It's part of a broader system where power over transformation belongs to anyone except the creature being transformed. And we accept this. Saksheben, we celebrate it. We build our entire relationship with Pokemon around it. The trainer is the one who decides when evolution happens. Chris, the trainer controls what the Pokemon becomes. The trainer shapes the Pokemon's future. That's not partnership, Bryn. That's not mutual growth. That's a power dynamic so extreme that it would be considered unethical in almost any other context. But in Pokemon, it's just Tuesday. The Pokemon games give you choices, lots of them. Which starter to pick, which Pokemon to catch, which moves to teach, which evolution path to pursue when options exist. And these choices feel meaningful. They feel like they matter. They create the illusion that you're making important decisions about your team, about your journey, about your relationship with your Pokemon. But whose choices are they really? When you choose Vaporeon over Jolteon, you're making a choice. But Eevee isn't. When you decide to max friendship during the day to get Espeon, you're making a choice. But Eevee isn't. When you use a Firestone instead of a Waterstone, you're making a choice. But Eevee isn't. All the agency in the system belongs to the trainer. All the decision-making power, all the control over outcomes. What are the Pokemon are props in your story, variables in your strategy, resources to be allocated and optimized. And the games reinforce this by rewarding strategic choices, type coverage, competitive viability, filling the Pokédex. You're incentivized to view Pokemon as tools to be used effectively rather than as individuals with their own preferences and desires. Eevee makes this particularly stark because its entire existence is about your choice. But every Pokemon in the game exists primarily to facilitate player choice, to give you options, to create variety in your experience. The Pokemon themselves don't get to choose. They exist in a world where their fundamental nature can be altered. Their biological structure can be rewritten. Their entire existence can be transformed, all based on decisions made by beings who captured them and claim ownership over them. We call this training. We call this bonding. We call this the beautiful relationship between human and Pokemon. But strip away the narrative framing, and what you have is a system where sentient beings have no control over their own development, no say in their own transformation, no agency in determining what they become. The choice was never theirs. It was always ours. And we built an entire gaming franchise around celebrating that power imbalance. Here's the thing nobody wants to talk about. Do Pokemon consent to evolution? The games never ask this question. Evolution happens because you triggered it. The Pokemon transforms because the conditions were met. There's an animation. A jingle. Congratulations. Your Pokemon evolved. But did it want to? Some Pokemon in the anime refuse evolution. Ash's Pikachu famously rejects becoming Raichu. This is portrayed as a profound choice, as Pikachu asserting its identity and preference. And it is profound, because it's one of the few times a Pokemon is shown having agency over its own transformation. But here's what makes this significant. The fact that Pikachu refusing evolution is noteworthy. The fact that it's treated as exceptional reveals that the default assumption is Pokemon don't refuse. Pokemon don't resist. Pokemon just accept whatever transformation their trainers trigger. And for Eevee, refusal isn't even coded into its biology. There's no mechanism for an Eevee to say, no, I don't want to become Vaporeon. Nain. The genetic programming doesn't include an opt-out. The transformation triggers are automatic, unavoidable, irreversible. You can give a Pokemon an Everstone to prevent evolution. But that's the trainer's choice, not the Pokemon's. You're choosing to prevent transformation. The Pokemon still doesn't get input. It's just that your choice is don't evolve instead of evolve into X. Either way, the Pokemon's preferences are never actually consulted, and this raises a fundamental ethical question. Is it possible to consent to something you were designed to do? If Eevee's genetics are programmed to transform in response to specific stimuli, if its biology is engineered to accept these transformations, can it meaningfully consent to or refuse them? Or is consent itself impossible when the subject was designed to be compliant? This is the dark heart of Eevee's existence. It's not just that it lacks agency, it's that it was specifically designed to lack the capacity to withhold consent. Its genetics don't include the option to refuse transformation. The programming is mandatory, automatic, inescapable. You can't consent to something you can't refuse. And Eevee can't refuse. Not because it doesn't want to, but because the biological mechanisms for refusal were never installed. It was designed to be violated. And we call that adorable. So where does this leave us? Now that we've seen what Eevee really represents, Now that we understand the implications of its existence, we can unsee this. We can't go back to thinking of Eevee as just a cute Pokemon with lots of evolution options. We've looked beneath the surface. We've examined the genetic programming. We've confronted the ethical horror of a being designed to lack agency. And now we have to decide what to do with that knowledge. One option is to reject Eevee entirely. To acknowledge that what it represents is fundamentally wrong and refuse to participate in it. Don't catch Eevee. Don't evolve it. Don't celebrate the Eeveelutions. Treat it as the genetic abomination it appears to be and keep your distance. But that doesn't solve anything. Because Eevee isn't the problem. The system is the problem. And rejecting one Pokemon while continuing to participate in a system built on the same principles accomplishes nothing. You're still catching Pokemon, still triggering evolutions, still exercising power over beings that can't refuse you. Another option is to simply accept it. To acknowledge that this is how the Pokemon world works and make peace with it. Yes, Pokemon lack agency over their own transformation. Yes, the trainer-Pokemon relationship is built on power and balance. Yes, evolution is often forced rather than chosen. But it's a game, it's fiction, it's not real. So why does it matter? And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe analyzing the ethics of fictional creature transformation is absurd. Maybe we're taking this too seriously. Maybe Eevee is just a collection of pixels in code, and assigning it moral weight is foolish. But here's why it does matter. Fiction shapes how we think. Bidri, when the stories we tell ourselves about relationships, about power, about consent, they influence how we view real relationships, real power dynamics, real consent. When we teach children that it's wonderful to have a creature that can be anything you want, when we celebrate the ability to force transformation on something designed to be transformed, when we normalize the complete absence of agency as cute and desirable, we're teaching lessons about power and control. We're teaching that if something is designed to be controlled, controlling it is good. That if a being is vulnerable to manipulation, manipulating it is acceptable. That love means reshaping others to suit your needs. These are dangerous lessons, and they're embedded in one of the world's most popular children's franchises. Hidden behind adorable creatures and cheerful music and the promise of adventure and friendship, Eevee is a mirror, and what we see in that mirror should make us uncomfortable, not because Eevee is evil, but because what we do to Eevee, what we celebrate doing to Eevee, reveals something about how we think about power and agency and consent. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. After everything we've explored, after all the darkness we've uncovered, is there any possibility of redemption? Any hope for Eevee? Maybe, but it requires fundamentally reimagining what the trainer-Pokemon relationship could be. Imagine a version of the Pokemon world where evolution required genuine consent. A rune where Pokemon could refuse transformation, where trainers had to respect those boundaries, where friendship evolution only happened if the Pokemon actually wanted to evolve, not just because you hit the numerical threshold. Imagine Eevee with the ability to choose its own form. to decide for itself whether it wants to be aquatic or electrical or fiery, to have agency over its own transformation, to be a participant in its own development rather than a passive subject. This would require completely restructuring the genetics we've analyzed. It would require giving Eevee something it was designed not to have: self-determination, the ability to resist, the capacity to refuse, and it would require trainers to accept that their Pokemon might make choices they don't agree with, that Eevee might want to stay Eevee, or might want to become Vaporeon when you wanted Jolteon, that the Pokemon's preferences matter as much as yours. This would fundamentally change the power dynamic. It would transform the trainer-Pokemon relationship from ownership to genuine partnership, from control to collaboration, from forced transformation to mutual growth. But here's the thing. This version of Pokemon doesn't exist. The games are built on trainer agency, not Pokemon agency. The entire system assumes that trainers make the choices and Pokemon accept them. Changing that would require changing everything, and maybe that's what needs to happen. Maybe we need to acknowledge that the current system is built on foundations that wouldn't be acceptable in any other context. That we've normalized power imbalances and lack of consent because the subjects are fictional creatures. That we've hidden ethical violations behind cute designs and cheerful music. Eevee deserves better than to be a genetic puppet. It deserves the agency that was deliberately denied to it. It deserves the right to refuse transformation. The right to stay as it is. The right to choose what it becomes. All Pokemon deserve this, but Eevee especially, because Eevee was specifically designed not to have it. The hope isn't that Eevee will suddenly gain agency within the current system. The hope is that we, as players, as consumers, as people who engage with this franchise, will recognize what's wrong with the current system and demand better. We can acknowledge that we love Pokemon while also acknowledging that the world they inhabit is built on troubling premises. We can enjoy the games while also questioning the ethics they encode. We can appreciate Eevee's design while also recognizing that what it represents is fundamentally problematic. The hope is in the awareness, in seeing clearly, in refusing to accept that cute packaging justifies ethical violations. Because once you see what Eevee really is, you can't go back to thinking it's just cute. And maybe that discomfort, maybe that inability to unsee the darkness, maybe that's the first step toward imagining something better. Let's state it plainly, without euphemism, without softening language. Eevee is a genetically engineered organism designed to lack agency over its own transformation. It exists in a state of perpetual dependency, forever waiting for external forces to determine what it becomes. Its genetic code contains multiple contradictory identities, all dormant, all waiting to be activated by stimuli it cannot control. It was created, deliberately or accidentally, to be the perfect subject of manipulation. Every Eeveelution represents a forced transformation. Every time you evolve an Eevee, you're pulling a trigger on genetic programming that gives the Pokemon no choice in the matter. Bro. Every time you celebrate having multiple Eeveelutions, you're celebrating your power to force multiple different transformations on multiple different subjects. This is what Eevee is. This is what the Eeveelutions represent. This is the truth that exists beneath the marketing and the merchandise and the fan art, and we love it anyway. We love Eevee, not in spite of this, but because of it. We love that it can be anything we want. We love that we have complete control over what it becomes. We love that it exists solely to facilitate our choices. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but it's true. The popularity of Eevee isn't accidental. It's not just about cute design. It's about power, about control, about having a creature that will become whatever you decide it should be without resistance or refusal. That's the appeal. Though that's always been the appeal, but we just didn't want to admit it. Eevee is a monument to our desire for control over others. A genetic manifestation of the fantasy that something could exist solely to serve our preferences. A being designed to have no will that might conflict with ours. And the Pokemon franchise has built an empire partly on this fantasy. Cute creatures that exist to be collected, trained, evolved, and used according to our strategic preferences, with Eevee as the perfect exemplar of complete malleability. This is what we've been celebrating all along. We just called it friendship. So here we are. At the end of this journey into the darkness at the heart of Eevee's existence, we've examined the genetic evidence suggesting artificial origin. We've analyzed the evolution mechanics that strip agency from the Pokemon. We've confronted the ethical implications of friendship-based evolution. We've explored what it means for a being to be designed without the capacity to refuse transformation. And we've realized that Eevee isn't just a Pokemon. It's a question, a challenge, a mirror showing us something uncomfortable about ourselves. What are we willing to accept in the name of entertainment? What power imbalances are we comfortable with as long as the subjects are cute? What violations of agency can we normalize when they're packaged as gameplay mechanics? Eevee forces us to confront these questions, not because it's uniquely evil, but because it's uniquely honest. It doesn't hide what it is. Its entire existence is built around transformation it cannot control. Its appeal is explicitly based on being able to become whatever the trainer wants. It's the Pokemon franchise showing its hand, revealing the power dynamic that exists beneath all the talk of friendship and partnership. Admitting that the relationship between trainer and Pokemon is fundamentally built on control. And now that we've seen this, we have to decide what it means for how we engage with Pokemon going forward. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe we continue playing the games we love while acknowledging their problematic elements. Maybe we separate fiction from reality and enjoy Eevee without guilt. Or maybe it means something. Maybe it changes how we think about agency and consent in fictional contexts. Maybe it makes us more aware of the lessons embedded in the media we consume. Maybe it inspires us to imagine better systems, better relationships, better worlds. Either way, we can't unsee what Eevee reveals. We can't go back to innocent enjoyment of its multiple evolution options. We know what it represents now. We understand what it was designed to be, a creature without the capacity to refuse, a being engineered to be shaped by others, a Pokemon without a soul, or at least without the agency necessary to claim ownership of that soul. Eevee isn't just missing an internal evolution method, it's missing something far more fundamental: self-determination, the right to remain unchanged, main key, the ability to say no, and that absence, that designed void where agency should be. That's what makes Eevee simultaneously the most popular and the darkest Pokemon in the entire franchise. We love what we can control. Carmignain and Eevee was designed to be controlled. That's the truth. That's what the unstable genetics really mean. That's what the radiation triggers actually do. That's what friendship evolution truly represents. Control, disguised as care. Manipulation, disguised as bonding. Power, disguised as partnership. And Eevee, beautiful, adorable, beloved Eevee, is the perfect instrument of that disguise. Before we close, I want to hear from you. Now that you've seen what Eevee really represents, now that you understand the implications of its genetic programming, how do you feel about it? Does this change how you view the Eeveelutions? Can you still enjoy them knowing what they mean? Or does the awareness make it impossible to see them the same way? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Eeveelution, I genuinely want to know if this resonates with you, or if you think I've gone too far down the rabbit hole. Because these are uncomfortable truths, and I'm curious how others process them. If this deep dive into Pokemon's darkest implications spoke to you, if this kind of unflinching analysis of the things we love is something you want more of, hit that subscribe button. Then, because there are so many more disturbing truths hiding in plain sight within the games and anime we grew up with. Thank you, and I'm just getting started uncovering them. And if this video made you think, if it challenged how you see Eevee and the Eeveelutions, if it sparked something in your mind, leave a like. It helps more people find content like this. Content that doesn't just celebrate what we love, but questions, examines it, and reveals what it truly means. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into the genetic nightmare that is Eevee. Thank you for confronting these uncomfortable truths instead of looking away. Thank you for being willing to see what lies beneath the cute exterior. Eevee is the Pokemon without a soul. Or perhaps more accurately, Eevee is the Pokemon whose soul was deliberately replaced with programming, with conditional statements and genetic triggers and transformation protocols that leave no room for refusal. And we made it a cultural icon. That's the final truth. The one we have to carry forward. The knowledge we can't unknow. Sleep well with that thought, if you can.